There are skills and strategies that women are more likely to use. And yes, some of these things have been socialized from the time people are little, but are actually incredibly valuable for anyone, men or women. We should all be going back and studying the way the women in my book are leading, because now more than ever, especially coming out of the pandemic, it's really essential to understand that leadership isn't a top-down thing. It's not about a guy in a corner office. It's about figuring out how to get the most out of your team. And empathy is a big piece of that. Vulnerability is a big piece of that. And these skills and strategies that women are more likely to deploy are really could be superpowers for anyone.
Today, I have a woman that is going to blow you away because she literally does it all. Besides being a rock star on TV, she's a mom, she's a professional, she is incredible. So rather than me tell you more about her, all right, I'll tell you a little bit more just to tease you. She is a woman that has been in the forefront of business news as a hard-driving business journalist professional in Tech Check and on CNBC, the Distributor 50. And I will tell you, I watched
Disruptor 50.
I'm sorry. I watch CNBC. And when I tell you this woman is on in the morning, she's on in the middle of the day, she's on at night, I don't know when she sleeps. So without further ado, let me welcome Julia Boorstin to today's episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Patty Ann. What should I call you? Patty Ann? Dr. Patty Ann?
Dr. Patty Ann. I've been called a lot worse. So Julia, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, the world is insane today. Business is changing at the speed of light. And I know you're on top of it all, but I do want to ask you a question. Oh, and of course, Julia also wrote a book, and we'll talk a lot more about that later, When Women Lead. So all my listeners know I am passionate about highlighting successful business women because there's really not a lot of us, in spite of
not enough,
what people want to think. So Julia, here's my question to you. What can you share with us now that most people don't know about you that's led to your success as a person, right? That we can't find in your book, because we're going to get everybody to read the book, that they can't find out from Googling you. Maybe even your best friend doesn't know.
Oh, I feel like my best friends know a lot about me. I guess the question is in what category?
Anyone you want. This is all. I want you to be your best self.
I think you mentioned that I don't get a lot of sleep. I wake up at 4:40 a.m. I like to wake up at 4:40 because then you could pretend it's closer to 5 than closer to 4. I'll say I wake up at 20 to 5. I really wake up at 4:40. Sometimes I wake up earlier. Yesterday, I woke up at 3:30 a.m. I think the question is like, why do I wake up so early? Why do I have such a crazy schedule? And I think it's because I find these things and I really invest in these things that I really love to do. And so with my kids, we were just talking before we started about how I made these crazy pancakes, like art design pancakes with different colors, and you're like drawing designs with the pancakes. And I was exhausted and they woke me up really early, but it was so much fun to sort of go deep and do this project together. And I feel like that's how I am with my book. That's how I'm with my job. I created the Disruptor 50 list because I really wanted to learn more about startups and technology. And it's been such a gift. So I feel like I can get away with too little sleep, or I can sort of push myself really hard if I'm doing these projects that are really exciting. So this morning, I wasn't just making my pancakes and serving them to my kids. I was saying, okay, we're making this project together. You're going to help me out. We're going to make like pancakes that look like kitty cats or with stars. And it was just really fun. So I think for me, it's about taking things to that next level. And that's what really motivates me and gets me out of bed early in the morning. That's what I'd say, because I wake up very early.
Okay. So I'm so struck by, the games we play with ourselves, right, to get things done. And of course, Julia doesn't know this about me, but I can't cook to save my life. So thank you for throwing me under the bus there, making kitty cat pancakes. So, but it sounds like what you're really saying is that you're passionate about the projects that you take on.
I think that passion is the only way to do anything because it's so hard to get anything done. It's hard to be a worker, be a parent, to balance all these things. And I think the way to accomplish anything is really finding a way to channel your passions. And for me, I'm a better mom when I'm like, guys, I'm really excited to try this new pancake project. I'm not just going to have you sit on the couch while I do it myself. Let's do it together. Or I'm really excited to learn about female founders and leaders, and I want to learn more. And to me, I look back at when I was writing my book, When Women Lead, and I would wake up at 5 a.m. on a Saturday so I could get 4 hours of writing done before I was going to be with my kids. And I was like, that's crazy that I did that. How did I get up so early on the weekend after an exhausting week? And the answer is I just really was excited about the project. And I think for me, whether it's if I throw a dinner party and I'm like, oh, I'm so excited to try these new recipes or to gather these people and introduce people who don't know each other, it's all about finding what excites me and either finding it or creating it, because that's what makes life interesting.
So I'm struck by what you said, because when I wrote my book, my 2 books, my best-selling books, I did the same thing. I would get up early in the morning and I would, at night when the kids went to bed, I have 4 children, I would write then. And I look back on it now and I have no idea how I did it. Like no clue. Although, true confessions, I wasn't throwing dinner parties. I was 1-800, get order in kind of thing, or order takeout. So I'm just so struck by all your talents, but I'm curious as to what sparked that passion in you as a little girl, because so many women as little girls get their passion snuffed out of them, or we're told what we should do. And I already know you don't do the shoulds. So where did that come from?
I think it comes from asking questions. In my family, it was but not just curiosity, not just to be curious, but to ask questions. You can be curious yourself and not do anything about it. And what was really valued in my family was asking questions. And asking questions was a showing that you cared about someone. It was a sign of respect. It was a sign of interest. And I think there was this idea that if you asked a question, you were showing someone you cared, but also you should be curious yourself. And that and I say this to my kids now, my parents said to me, I would say, oh, I'm bored. They'd say, there's no reason you should be bored. Go find something to learn about and you won't be bored anymore.
Or go read today.
Or especially today. So I think for me, it all starts with this idea of asking questions and seeing where that leads. Because if you're really asking questions, you don't know where it's going to lead. And for me, I started the Disruptor 50 list at CNBC because I was so curious to learn about companies long before they go public. What can we learn about what makes a company really disruptive? What's going to make something really change the business landscape? And it really started when I was covering the Facebook IPO. And I was like, this is a company that's really a game changer. How can we learn about more companies like these? Which other companies are going to be in the same category as a Facebook in terms of being so industry defining and disruptive? And so I think it's all about asking those questions. How do you ask questions in a data-driven way? How do you get answers that are really data-driven to make sure you're not just getting opinions? How do you learn about people based on the opinions they give you? So it all starts with asking the questions. And my book and my passion for this book project that got me up at all hours and really became my passion project started with the questions. I was meeting and interviewing these phenomenal female CEOs and leaders, and I was so impressed by them. And I would be interviewing them about their business on CNBC. And then before the cameras started rolling and after they turned off, I would be asking them questions like, how did you get here? How did you accomplish this? There are so few women in positions like yours. You have 4 kids. How do you do that? So I found myself asking them these questions because I was so curious about how they had defied the odds and accomplished these amazing things. And what I realized is I wanted to ask more questions and I wanted other people to be able to benefit from these answers. I would leave these interviews and I'd come home and I'd tell my husband, I'm like, oh my God, I interviewed the most amazing woman today. This company is crazy. It's turning pollution into fuel. And the woman who runs this company is not at all what you'd expect from a CEO. And this woman who I'm referring to is this woman named Jennifer Holmgren, who runs a company called Lanzatech. And what I wanted to say to the world was there are so many different ways to lead. There are so many different ways to succeed, and there isn't a one size fits all model. And I wanted to get these answers for myself, and then I wanted to share them with the world. So it all started with these questions and me being very excited to just interview over 100 women about their stories, how they managed to do it, what they learned along the way, what they know now that they wish they had known then, and the lessons that they would pass on. So I started by wanting to ask those questions of the women. And then as I went through these interviews, I started finding these themes. So these things that had sort of defined these women's ability to succeed despite the odds, leading with empathy, trying to find a big picture solution to a problem rather than just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, approaching things by like really drawing on the power of their team. Or some women were leading with this really raw, vulnerable honesty about their failures and their weaknesses, things that you do not typically see in business books or in male leaders.
By the way, I was going to say women are much more willing to share their vulnerabilities. Men
100%.
Lost $100 million in a meeting. They don't bring it up. Like, oh, that's 100 million. Yeah, well, they move on. Women's like, but I want to apologize for losing that money, and now everybody knows.
And everyone knows. And then they feel like they can admit things too, or ask for help. So I found these questions. I got all these answers. And then I had more questions that I had about why these approaches enabled women to be so successful. And so that led me to all of this academic research. I hadn't used LexisNexis since I was in college, but all of a sudden I was diving through literally 325 academic studies about what different skills and strategies and traits enabled people to be successful, why things like diversity are valuable for business, and how women are more likely to do some of these things. They're just more likely to do them. And these, again, are things that are socialized, not because of biology. Women are trained in empathy. From the time girls are very little, they're trained on how to be empathetic with their friends. So the questions from the women gave me answers that led me to my own questions about why they were able to be so successful. And that sent me digging into the data. And again, with the passion, I would wake up really early in the morning and read these academic studies, and they would be mind-blowing. And it was so much fun to find out why these women were so successful. So what I ultimately found is my questions about all of these things led me to some really interesting answers, which I was very excited to share with the world in my book, When Women Lead. And so I think it all starts with the curiosity and wanting to know.
So let me for a second. I not take this with a grain of salt, but you're reminding me of myself when you're talking with your passion, because I'll be coaching a client or I'll meet somebody and I'll go home and I'll call my husband. Oh my gosh, I met this most amazing person. And he knows I have a captive audience. Like, he has to listen to me because I won't stop, right? Because people are so fascinated. So I hear the journalist in you coming out, because when you talk about asking right questions for the right reasons, right? Like, as a coach, the best coaches don't give advice. They ask the right questions, right? And that's where you get the information. So I hear the passion, but what I'm also hearing, which I do think ties into women, so I want your feedback on this. You mentioned a couple of different things. You spoke about, without using the word authenticity, about being genuine, about the ability to create a trusting environment that can only be created by understanding on being vulnerable. If I'm vulnerable to you, you'll be vulnerable to me, and then we will create trust. And also, which is a different conversation, but I think it's emotional intelligence as well, because women are taught to play nice in the sandbox. Doesn't mean we're not driven, doesn't mean that we're not competitive and passionate about what we do. But we understand that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together.
And I would say you even go fast. You can go fast as a team too. So that's,
you know what I mean? So where do those attributes of leadership show up in all your work? And and by the way, I watch you. I am a fan of yours, and you do ask great questions. And you're creating a genuine connection. It feels that way.
And the way I think, I've practiced and I study interviewing, right? This is what I do for my job is I want to be a really good question asker. And the most important thing is doing your research ahead of time, but then when you're in the middle of an interview, you just have to really listen. And the joke among my colleagues is I will spend days and days and days prepping for an interview, and I have all these notes and questions printed out, and then I don't look at them when I'm doing the interview.
You get to two.
Or I don't. I have them in my lap, but it's the research that I put into getting those questions ready that enables me, once the interview is happening in real time, to ask the questions that I know are the next best question to ask. But your question was how did these things all tie together for women?
Yes, you said because what you were speaking about from the questioning that allows you to create the connection, because I believe everything's relationships. Business. If you don't know relationships, you don't know business, right? The business itself is 20% of the business. I believe 80% of it is relationships.
Well, but also you have to manage people. There's managing people, which is about relationships. You have to work with outside parties. You have to sell to consumers. But I think what I was so excited to discover in the research and also in the stories is that there are skills and strategies that women are more likely to use. And yes, some of these things have been socialized from the time people are little, but are actually incredibly valuable for anyone, men or women. We should all be going back and studying the way the women in my book are leading, because now more than ever, especially coming out of the pandemic, it's really essential to understand that leadership isn't a top-down thing. It's not about a guy in a corner office. It's about figuring out how to get the most out of your team. And empathy is a big piece of that. Vulnerability is a big piece of that. And these skills and strategies that women are more likely to deploy could be superpowers for anyone. You mentioned authenticity, and I feel like I'm not quite getting your question right.
No, you're doing this.
But to go back to this question of authenticity, I feel like I try to avoid using the word authenticity because I feel like it's used so much. It's almost like lost its meaning because it's like so prevalent. Mm-hmm. It's all over the place. But you're absolutely right. What it really is about is figuring out.
What word do you like to use?
It's interesting. I also like to use the word pattern matching instead of unconscious bias because I think it's more specific. For me, all of these women who have succeeded, and really any leader who succeeds, is really honest with themselves and really understands what they're good at and what they're not good at, and has done a lot of self-searching and a lot of self-examination to really lay out their skills and their weaknesses and their strengths and their weaknesses. That's self-awareness. It's ultimate self-awareness and emotional intelligence. But I think also every good leader has a growth mindset. And to me, growth mindset, and I talk about this with my kids all the time, a growth mindset is really about the combination of confidence and humility. Confidence that you know what you know, and that you have the ability to keep on learning. And you have you have the confidence that you can keep learning and keep trying and learning. And the humility that you don't already know everything. Mm-hmm. And so if you have that right balance, and by the way, sometimes the balance is going to shift. Sometimes you need to have a lot of confidence when you go into a room to pitch your idea, but you won't need to have humility when you're out there learning. Mm-hmm. And there's a study I reference in the book about this idea, and there's an author called Therese Houston who writes about this idea that confidence should be on a dial. You don't want to be super confident all the time. I was told you're supposed to be confident all the time. If you show weakness, that's a terrible thing. Mm-hmm. Not true. Again, there are all these myths that are not true. But this idea that she puts forth that I love and I think about all the time is that confidence should be on a dial. You should turn down your confidence when you're gathering information from your team, you're going around an organization wanting to bring as many different perspectives as possible. Then you use that information, you synthesize it, you come up with a perspective and an approach. And then when it comes out to time to execute your plan and to communicate about your plan, then you dial back up the confidence and you go out there and you do it. But to me, that also fits in with a growth mindset. What that is right there is a growth mindset. You have the humility to go out there and learn and to say, I don't know anything, help me figure out the answer. And then you have the confidence to go and execute. So I think it all comes down to self-knowledge and a growth mindset. And the combination of those two things make a great leader, whether it's when women lead or when anybody leads.
I agree with that. And I mean, I love, Carol Dweck, right? The mother of growth mindset.
And I quote Carol Dweck in the book quite a bit.
Right. Like she's, growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And I do think a little bit of a sidebar, but not really, because these will be the future leaders, is that kids today just tend to do what they're good at because it reinforces what they're good at. But there's a whole, but how many of us are really good at how many?
Well, nobody starts off really good at anything. I mean, that's the thing.
Everybody sucks in the beginning, right? And then it's the humility to say, I need to learn, but have the confidence to believe that you can.
Exactly. And I think also there's another component of discomfort. And I write in the book about the advantages of having the discomfort of diversity. And discomfort is something that successful people learn how to sit in.
Yep.
And successful leaders, they're okay being uncomfortable. Stretching yourself, trying new things, it's really uncomfortable. Facing with perspectives and ideas that are totally different than your own, really uncomfortable. But I feel like and I get, again, for my job, interviewing people in tough situations, quite uncomfortable sometimes.
Sure.
And you have to figure out how to manage that. But I think that if you have a sense of your own identity and your own authenticity, it's okay to be faced with perspectives that are different because you're saying, this is good. I want to broaden my view of the world. Again, growth mindset. But I think people really need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
I was just going to say,
it's okay not to be comfortable all the time.
And I just did a leadership training and I spoke so much about discomfort is where all growth is. If you're comfortable, you're just reinforcing what you know, which is great. But comfort is the danger zone. You will never grow, you never learn. So if you think of a rubber band, you stretch it, you don't break it. So I love that. I want to go back to something you said earlier. I'm so curious about this. You said that you interviewed this woman, you went home, you told your husband, and then you said she was not at all what I thought she would be like.
She's not at all the stereotype of what CEOs are supposed to be like.
Please speak to that, because I know you can help women, because I believe women more than men think they're not they don't fit the profile for.
Well, women don't fit the stereotype. There is a stereotype that's been around since the beginning of time that leaders are men, and in our culture, leaders have predominantly been white men, and that has been a stereotype that is the dominated society. So I started as a business journalist in the year 2000 at Fortune magazine. Okay. And back then, Jack Welch, who ran GE, was the prototype of what a leader was supposed to be like. Everyone talked about Six Sigma, which is his strategy of running the company. And there were all these acolytes and people who just said, this is what management should be like. This is what leadership should look like. And then there became this other vision of leadership, which was a guy in hoodie in Silicon Valley. And he was a guy in a hoodie, and he also was a visionary and a genius, and he made decisions that everyone else followed. Those stereotypes were very homogenous in terms of the image of what a person looked like in that role, but also showed a sort of visionary leader who came up with the idea in the corner office or the equivalent, and then delegated down below. And there was a lot of talk about delegating, but not micromanaging, and sharing your vision, and it was just a very specific image of what a CEO looked like and what they sounded like and how they acted like. But I would say history has shown that does not yield successful leadership.
Well, look at what happened with GE.
Look at what happened with GE.
35 years. I could go on and on and
exactly.
on.
And so I met this woman who was running a company called Lanzatech for an interview for CNBC. And she is a very petite, barely 5 foot tall Colombian immigrant. She speaks in a very faint voice. Before we did our interview, she said, I really hate public speaking. I really hate public speaking. I really hate doing this.
Can you speak up?
Yeah. And I said, what do you mean? You've raised hundreds of millions of dollars. How are you pitching to investors? How are you making partnerships with people like Richard Branson if you hate public speaking so much? You're like the opposite of a Richard Branson. Like, I can't even imagine you going into these rooms and raising hundreds of millions of dollars. And she said, and so then I followed up with her when I decided to write the book. And I said, I'd love to learn more about you and your story and how you managed to be so successful despite not fitting the stereotype of male leadership, both in appearance or in behavior. And she said, I'm introverted. I'm very soft-spoken. I'd rather listen than speak. And she said, I figured out how to program my business around that and also how to use it to my advantage. I said, well, what do you mean? So she said, well, first I realized that if I went to a big meeting, I shouldn't invite a bunch of men to go with me because then I would just let them speak and I wouldn't make the pitch. And it was better for me as a CEO to make the pitch. So she sort of programmed things to make sure she was not enabling herself to fall back. So that was one thing where she said, structurally, I need to figure out a system that would really push me outside of my comfort zone. So she's like, I've done plenty of things that are hard for me and uncomfortable, but because it's really important and because this business is so important. She said, secondly, I figured out how to use my preference for listening over speaking as a huge advantage and a huge superpower. And I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? She said that when she goes into meetings, she listens. And a lot of people in her position are pitching and are negotiating and are just really getting out there and trying to get a word in edgewise constantly. And she says, I don't do that. I don't try to get a word in edgewise. I listen to what the counterparty in my negotiation. So this means either an investor or one of the huge power plants she's negotiating with, or someone who's buying her fuel. She listens to what they want and they start off telling her what they think she wants to hear. And then they keep talking and they tell her a little bit closer to what they're actually feeling. And if she just lets them keep on talking, they finally get to what they really want. And she basically listens and listens and listens until she really understands what her counterparty negotiations actually wants. And she says, this can be a win-win situation. If I really know what their priorities are, I could suggest a deal or a collaboration that's going to really help both of us. So she listens until she gets to the root of the issue, and then she can come back with a solution that she thinks is going to be a win-win rather than having a lot of fighting and backing and forth. She's like, let me just listen and really understand. So she has turned her introversion, which is described as a flaw in business traditionally, into listening, which is a superpower, and has really been a game changer for her and her ability to scale this massive business.
So listening, active listening, I think is the most underrated skill of communication in every area of life. And it's, of course, an aspect of effective communication, which I think determines the overall quality of your life. Do you see, not just with your research, but with the countless men and women that you've interviewed throughout your career, a difference in the ability to actively listen between men and women, entrepreneurs, corporate?
Active listening was not one of the skills and strategies that women are more likely to have. Women rate higher. I'm talking about scientifically with all the research. Women tend to have higher levels of empathy, which can be related to active listening, but empathy is really the ability to see something from someone else's perspective. Sure. Women show more vulnerability. Women practice more gratitude. Women are more likely to lead in a communal style. So by pulling on the perspectives of people from across their organization. And that could relate to active listening. Women are also more likely to be looking for the big picture and a big picture solution. So like if someone is sick, not like, can we give them medicine to fix the sickness right now, but like, why are they really sick? What are the underlying issues? Yeah. Are there concerns about their diet? And I have some very good examples of women like that. And then women are also more likely to bring an outsider's perspective to fix an industry that may be broken. So we've seen women say, I'm not part of this industry. This industry is never, like say the retail industry has always been run by men, even though it's serving women. How can we do this differently? How can I make this a better product or service for the people like me? Same thing is true for women's healthcare. So I think there are a lot of things about sort of sensitivity to problems and to the source of problems that's really at the heart of it. But active listening, I haven't seen a lot of research on.
Can I challenge you for a moment?
Yeah.
Okay. From what you've said, and all my work is all this stuff with the business, not the business itself. I think active listening is, you can't do anything that you just described without somebody being able to actively listen.
That's true.
Right? So let's just talk about empathy. You cannot create empathy if you haven't created a connection with someone. Otherwise, nobody cares about each other, right? If you don't like someone, if you haven't connected with them in a healthy way, it's hard to care what they have to say. Yes, we all work on it, but let's be honest, right? I have to work on, if I don't like you, caring what you have.
But don't you think that if you don't have humility, then you can't listen? It's much easier to listen actively if you have humility. If you already think you have all the answers, why would you bother, right?
Of course. Well, if you don't have humility, you can't be an effective leader.
Yeah.
Right. But my point is, the empathy is a prerequisite for that empathy is the connection. the prerequisite for the connection is communication.
Yeah.
And you can't communicate effectively without the active listening. So I hear what you're saying, but I guess I feel like the active listening is the common denominator underneath
for all of those things. Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I think that you can't communicate, you can't learn from the people around you. You can't run a team if you're not listening actively. And I guess the old model of leadership, or sort of the more traditional model of leadership, was a top-down leadership, what they call agentic leadership, someone saying
command
this is the
control.
plan. Yeah, and what I believe the future of leadership is, that women traditionally have done really well, is a communal leadership. How can I learn from the people around me? They're on the ground, they're around the country, they're seeing what's actually happening. How can I learn from them to make better decisions that reflect what's actually happening around the country?
Historically, you have hunter-gatherers, right? And the women were the gatherers. But I want to ask you a question that's a little bit off tangent, but not really. I promise we'll get back, which is, tell me your feelings and thoughts, both, on the glass cliff for women, right?
Oh, yes.
Part of that.
So first, I guess I should explain what the glass cliff is. So we've heard of the glass ceiling, the idea that women rise through the ranks and then they hit a ceiling where they were just not making it to the top. And there's no official reason why, but it's very frustrating. So statistically, I think it's worth pointing out that female CEOs represent about 10% of the Fortune 500. Women in the C-suite are about 25%. The numbers go up and down. It's much, yeah. The women in the C-suite has gone up much faster than women at the CEO level.
I wonder what that stat would be if you minused HR and marketing, but go ahead.
Well, CMOs, CHROs, yeah. So there's an interesting conversation to be had about the glass ceiling. The glass cliff is this phenomenon which has been studied by a lot of researchers for 20 years now. This idea that women are more likely to be hired or appointed into leadership roles when a company is in a precarious situation or there is a lot of challenges in general in the industry. So this idea that if a company is failing, women are more likely to be hired as CEO. And there's been a lot of speculation. Why is that? One might be they say, let's take a risk on this woman who maybe they wouldn't have taken a risk on if they felt like things were in better shape.
But they have nothing to lose. It's already
nothing to lose. Yes. And so the reason why why is it a risk? Is because the woman does not look like what a traditional CEO would look like. So she doesn't sort of meet the stereotype. So it seems like a risk if you're breaking this pattern. If you have a bunch of white men CEOs, why would we break the pattern if things are working? Maybe it's okay to break the pattern if things aren't working. Maybe they've already tried everyone else and the woman is the last one left. But there's a lot of research on it. And there was actually an interesting study I found. Again, I love my studies back in 2005 in the UK that they found this phenomenon. Then the financial crisis happened in 2008 and 2009. And there were more studies on this phenomenon. And what they interestingly found is yes, women are more likely to be hired into these positions when a company is like in the financial crisis in a precarious position. But what they found is that women actually tend to do really well in those situations. Oftentimes they fail because the company's already in so much trouble that there's no fixing it. But women tend to outperform their male counterparts if they start a job when a company is suffering. So I think that's really interesting and very important. Also, and there was a lot of research around this during the pandemic, when there is a time of crisis, either generally or specifically, employees would rather have a female boss, would rather have a female CEO. Because communication. Empathy and communication, because the employees feel like if things are chaotic and scary, they'd rather have the clear and empathetic communication from a female boss.
So I was going to ask you about earlier when you just said about the women being more successful. I was going to ask you why, with the glass cliff, and I was going to ask you why, but is it the communication as well?
Well, that might be part of it, but there's also something we call adaptability quotient. And so we've talked about IQ, and then there was this big focus on EQ. And then during the pandemic, there was a sort of increasing shift to something that I wrote about a lot in my book, which is AQ, adaptability quotient. And the idea that the people who are most successful are not the smartest ones. They're the ones who have the ability to make the swiftest decisions when things change.
Pivot.
And there is a stereotype of women that they have a hard time making choices. That's just not true. The research shows that when situations change, women are more likely to follow data and say, okay, the numbers are showing this. I'm going to make a change because the numbers are showing that things are changing really quickly. And they're more likely to make swift, data-driven decisions. It's really hard to let go of a plan. Think about the way companies work or teams work. You spend months, you spend years making plans. And then if the situation changes dramatically, like it did during the pandemic, you have to pivot or make changes. Again, pivot is a word that's overused. Yep. You have to make changes really quickly, not based on instinct, not based on what you invested all this time and money to do, but you have to make changes based on the data. So what the research has shown is that women have less maybe emotional or egotistical tie to the plan that was made. Yeah. And they say, it's okay. We made this plan. Guess what? The plan isn't relevant anymore. We need to change course because the situation has changed. So this idea of using data to look around corners, I think is really important, and to not have an emotional attachment to a plan you made. It's not about your feelings. This is about the numbers. Use the numbers as a guide. And there were a number of great examples.
Hang on one second before you go there. I just want to say this. So you just busted another myth with women, right? The myth is women are emotional. The data shows that women do not get irrationally attached to their plan when the data suggests otherwise. I think many of the listeners will be surprised by that. I love that. And the other piece is women have the humility to say, we need to change course. It's not like this is wrong, but as you said before, it's just not relevant anymore. And I think I think that's different for many male leaders.
But I think, I hope everyone starts leading like women have been leading. Like, I want to get to a place where everyone is leading with humility and vulnerability and gratitude and all these things. So these traits that have been more traditionally female are actually adopted by men increasingly. And there's actually some amazing research showing that when men do lead with these styles, they are effective too. So for instance, this concept of servant leadership, this concept of prioritizing your employees and your customers, along with your investors, and understanding that you have to treat your employees with great respect and as a priority, and you're going to be more effective if you do that. This is something that women are more likely to do. But guess who else has done it? Howard Schultz, who founded and grew Starbucks into a massive company, and also Fred Smith, who grew FedEx into an enormous powerhouse, global powerhouse.
Who did the turnaround for Boeing.
Yeah.
For Ford.
And so these are men who have said, I have to lead with servant leadership. If I don't, I'm not going to be successful. But yet the traits of servant leadership are things you see more frequently with women. Mm-hmm. What I would say is just because women are more likely to do these things doesn't mean that everyone should be doing them. And I love finding these examples of men saying, I have to be leading with empathy. And I've actually found, since my book came out, there's so many men right now who understand that with so much uncertainty in the world, so much volatility, that they absolutely need to embrace the skills that I write about in my book, When Women Lead. The idea of leading with empathy, that's table stakes now. You can't get away with running a company and managing people without having empathy with what's going on in the world and all the craziness that is sort of creating everyday volatility, or frankly, with vulnerability about what you know and you don't know. It's such a volatile world, whether we're talking about the economy or inflation. You have to have a sort of brutal honesty about your skill set and your area of expertise and where you are in navigating these things. And so I think I'm hearing from a lot of men that they understand that these skills and strategies that have enabled these women to defy the odds, these are things that they need to make a priority as well.
That is great. Where do you see, I guess this is backwards, the value and the difference between men and women? When you spoke about vision, you spoke about being able to change course. What about the initial creation of creating a strategic vision, right? That's the North Star. So where do men and women lead differently when it comes to that?
Well, I think one advantage that women have is being an outsider. Look, it's terrible to be an outsider and to have there be a men's club, a boys' club that you're not part of. There's no doubt that that's painful. And I'm sure many women who are listening to this have felt that at times. But I think that the women who have succeeded have figured out how to use their outsider perspective as a huge advantage.
Great. Yeah.
And I think that the combination of insider experience, you've worked at a company, maybe it's been painful to be the only woman on a team, but you understand how an industry works or how a company works. But if you have an outsider perspective, because maybe you were never accepted as part of the core group, if you can combine those two things, insider expertise with outsider perspective, then you have the possibility and the potential to drive real change. And I think when it comes to strategic vision, because women are not part of the stereotype, they're not part of the boys club, they can say, hey, the way you're doing things, it's not the best way to do it. Or I actually think what you're doing is morally wrong. I'm gonna tell you that you've just always done it this way. So it's never occurred to you to do it differently. But this isn't right. This isn't right for our customers. So I think that outsider perspective is really valuable. And there's a couple of phenomenons I write about in the book about how if you've been part of a culture or a company for a very long time, there's this thing that happens called cultural numbness, where you become oblivious to the flaws and the problems. You become numb to the issues at an organization. What I found in my research and in all of these examples is that women are more likely to be immune to cultural numbness because they're outsiders and they may not have as much representation. They may be in a tiny minority. And I think staying immune to cultural numbness is really powerful if you're trying to fix something.
I think that's great. It also feels like they don't get the advantage to the culture. So they're more open to its flaws. I'm just curious because you're very seasoned. In the past, the thinking was to be a successful business leader, you had to take on the attributes and the persona of men, right? And you had the pantsuits that were just god awful. Can you speak to that where and also if you were a woman and you were married and you had kids, like you would never say, I'm not coming into work because my kid is sick. Like you could say you have a flat tire, you could say a million things, but you couldn't show the fact that you were anything other than a driven, ambitious professional. How has that shifted over the years?
So I think as there have been more women in leadership positions, it has normalized the idea that not just women should leave and go to their kids' soccer game, but then men could as well. Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of the clothing, it's so funny. When I started my career as a young journalist, I would wear these boxy suits. I actually wore glasses I didn't really need, which is really embarrassing to admit, but I wore these glasses to make myself look more serious and professional when I was a 21-year-old reporter for Fortune magazine. But I think that it's true that women felt like they had to try to blend in with the men. I've interviewed so many women, and I write about this in my book. I have a part about sort of finding your own, using fashion as armor and finding the style that makes you feel most authentically you. You're not going to be an authentic leader if you're trying to look like someone who you're not. And I think that the more you could say, I'm never going to look like that guy. So why am I wearing a boring blue suit like him? I feel best when I'm wearing bright red dresses. Let me do the thing that makes me feel strongest and most like myself. And so I think there's been this shift over time. And I've even seen it in the past 20 years as a business journalist that women have been able to say, I'm not going to try to fit in because this is ridiculous. I'm never going to look like a guy. So why can't I just be the best version of myself? And I've seen a number of female CEOs who actually find that leaning into fashion or wearing bright, flamboyant things helps them stand out. And there was a woman I talked to, she said, yeah, if I go into a room and I'm the only woman there, I might as well be wearing a red dress. Why not? Right. And maybe the CEO is going to remember me more, or the investor is going to remember me because I'm the woman in the right red dress with a long hair down my back. So I think it's sort of
not even that, Julia, but to your point, you can't make a giraffe be a fish, right? And what I tell women all the time is, listen, if you are I'm the only woman in the room. I'm like, awesome. They're like, what do you mean awesome? I said, you just accomplished what every single guy in the Armani suit is trying to do. You are now noticed. Now show them what you got.
Yeah. And I think, and by the way, and then maybe try to help some other women get into the room with you.
Well, of course.
And I think that's a lot of what's changed actually is that 25 years ago, maybe there was only room for one woman in every room. Maybe there was only room for one woman on a board. But now there is an understanding that companies will be more successful if they have more diversity. And so I think women feel more generous about bringing other women with them, about opening the door. And there's a lot of research showing that women are more likely to prioritize mentorship and sponsorship, both in official capacities and also in more casual ways. And the fact that women are doing that is not surprising to me, because they get that they will be more successful if they have a more diverse array of perspectives, and also more women in the room with them as well, because I do think that the culture has changed. So if you were always going to be the only one, maybe it was more scary to dress like yourself and to really feel like yourself. But if you knew that there are going to be other people like you, it's not going to be a sea of dudes in suits and then one woman in a dress, then it maybe is a little bit less scary to find your authentic voice.
If there's two seats at the table for you, you're more willing to invite people in.
Exactly.
Right? I think men would have been the same as women if there was only one seat at the table, right? But to your point, I'll say it in the vernacular, you have to create a posse, right? Because nobody gets anywhere alone. I have a I'm dying to ask you this question. What is the one thing that you were surprised to find out, to discover?
Oh, there were so many surprises in my book. I was really impressed by the data that shows that the value of diversity isn't just that people bring outside perspectives and new perspectives. That's what I always assumed was like the value of diversity. You want other new perspectives. But the real value of diversity, and this is something I think about all the time, is that having people who are not like you around you separates you from the risk of groupthink and makes everyone, including the original homogenous group, smarter. And people are going to be smarter and make better analysis, better decisions if they are surrounded by people who are different than them and challenge their assumptions. And there's something about that I think has sort of been overlooked. And this idea that I want to be smarter, so I should be around people who are different than me. And I think that's something that people should remember. And again, it's uncomfortable. It might be uncomfortable. It might be hard, but I'm going to be better off for it. I think people are ultimately, they're self-motivated, and they will, I think we sort of need to shift the conversation about why people should care about diversity.
I think what you're saying is the echo chamber reinforces how smart you are.
And also it doesn't make you reconsider any of your assumptions. Yeah. And there's a great study for your listeners and viewers. There's a study about fraternity and sorority members and the value of diversity for them when they're trying to solve a fictional murder mystery. So that's my tease. You have to find the study in the book, because it's one of my favorite studies in When Women Lead.
Great.
Yeah. So it's a great one. And then I think the other thing that really surprised me was that gratitude was a business skill. And I had never considered gratitude having anything to do with business.
It's a huge people skill.
But gratitude to me was like, it's about friends and family. I'm gratitude for my health.
Neuroscience.
But so the neuroscience of gratitude is that gratitude correlates with patience. And if you feel gratitude for where you are, what you've got, what's happening in that moment, tolerance, then you will be able to make longer term business decisions. And this idea that gratitude needs to be deployed, not just in our personal lives, but in our professional lives, I really didn't understand how powerful that was. And I've seen it not just in the data, and there's some great studies I reference in the book, but to see it in so many of these women's studies. I mean, the reason I discovered this gratitude thing was because I was doing all these interviews, and I had this transcription app called Otter, where it records. Otter records all of your interviews, and then it transcribes them, and you could search by keyword. So I did a bunch of interviews over the course of a week, and women were talking about, oh, I was so grateful. I had this really traumatic experience. I was like, why would you be grateful for having a traumatic experience? I was grateful because it led me to the idea of founding my company. I was grateful that I had this proximity to people who were suffering so much, because I could figure out how to help them. And gratitude for things that seemed weird to be grateful for really made me realize that feeling gratitude for your position, whether it's a good position or a bad position, can enable you to do more with that position. And I found all these examples. And so I went back through all my other transcripts, and I was really searching for the word grateful, for the word blessed, for the word gratitude. It came up in so many different interviews. And then that led me to this research that women are more likely to practice gratitude, and gratitude is incredibly effective in business.
So I love that. And what I'll add to that is, wherever you go, there you are. So any skill set that works in your personal life will work in your professional life, of course, to adapt it. But the research, you'll love the data. The research shows the number one way to be happy is to be grateful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Coming from a happy perspective, right? So I could talk to you all day long, but I want to be respectful of your time. But I have two more questions.
Yes.
And then I'm going to ask you to unapologetically plug your book.
Okay.
First question. What's the one song you can't live without? And why?
I would say it has to be a Beatles song because my parents named me after the Beatles song Julia. And I love Hey Jude, and my son can play it on guitar and my other son can play it on piano. And so I really think it's a beautiful song. And it's great because everyone can sing it. It's in a key that everyone can sing. So it's a very sort of come together type song.
Great. Okay. And then my last question is, if I found a box of everything you ever lost in your life and I presented it to you, what would be the first thing you take out and look for and take out, and why?
Probably some photographs from before photos were all digitized and old photos that were probably lost somewhere between moves when I was a young adult, that sort of captured my family and friends at different phases.
Can you name a specific photo?
I would say there are some photographs of my girlfriends in high school, and we used to go on all these adventures. And my three best friends and I drove to the Grand Canyon one spring break and went camping there. And I don't have the photos from that trip. And I was trying to tell my kids about this trip, and I wish I had those photos. Okay, great. Okay, Julia, this has been fantastic. And I know there's so much more wisdom that you can share with everybody in your book, When Women Lead. So unabashedly tell people where they can get it and any other place where you'd like them to go to follow you, to learn more about you, of course, besides CNBC. Thank you so much. Also, my book is called When Women Lead, What They Achieve, Why They Succeed, and How We Can Learn from Them. The book, When Women Lead, is available on Amazon, at your local bookstore, anywhere online. Just search for When Women Lead. And you can also put in my name, Julia Boorstin. I have to say, I did a really good audiobook recording of my book. I even won an award for my audio recording of the book. So you can download it on Audible. You can also get the ebook on the Kindle. And you can follow me, not just on CNBC, but also on LinkedIn. You can find me, Julia Boorstin, on LinkedIn. I'm also on X, formerly known as Twitter, at @JBoorstin. And I'm on Instagram at Julia Boorstin. And you can see my adventures as a tech and media reporter at CNBC. But I hope you will all check out my book. There are some really fun and surprising studies and lots of really inspiring stories of women who have done phenomenal things. It's also a great holiday gift. So buy it for your mom, your sister, your best friend.
And it's not just for women.
It's not just for women. Actually, you should probably buy it for your male boss. So this should be the holiday gift for male bosses around the world.
And your sons, and all your sons.
My sons know all the stories. They've heard them all.
I mean, for the listeners' sons, right?
And for their sons. Yeah. And I would say this is actually a really good gift for people who are in their 20s and 30s and trying to navigate the work world and trying to figure out how to be effective leaders.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I encourage everybody, do not walk, run if you go into a traditional bookstore, or run to your keyboard and purchase When Women Lead. You will be so happy that you did. Julia, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom with us. This was so enjoyable, so insightful, and thank you for promoting women in the workforce at a very high level. Thank you.
Really my pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.